Welcome to MSP 1337. I'm your host, Chris Johnson, a show dedicated to cybersecurity challenges, solutions, a journey together, not alone. Everybody to another episode of MSP 1337. I'm joined this week by Robert Smith of Intellisystems. Robert, welcome to the show.
Pleasure being here, Chris.
So we decided that we're going to talk about, MSP, SMB, and I think to clarify what that means in the context of this is, what does it mean to have a cybersecurity maturity program within your organization? And I think a lot of this stems from how MSPs largely back in time and even to today went about putting in place to their clients the IT services and solutions to help provide a more optimized environment, protect the clients as best we knew how back then. And then fast forward today, what does that mean today? And I was just curious, with your background and knowing that you're going through the Trustmark and are waiting on getting that award, you said some things to me offline about knowing where you're at and knowing where you want to be. And the am I aware and do I have a plan in place to solve for this, or am I sort of ignorant and have no idea that it exists? And so with that, I'd like you to maybe start and share a little bit about thinking back in time to when 10 plus years ago, when MSPs started to become a thing and we shifted away from the break fix model. We really didn't focus on doing these things to our own businesses. We literally bought tools and services, and we reduced our per seat count per month by just not worrying about them with our own staff. What was that like? I mean, maybe you did this better than others, but what did it look like for you going back in time from an MSP standpoint, that model? And then we'll just kind of break it down as to where we are today and why the shift has been so significant.
Sure. So a little bit about like my background specifically and when I started kind of working with MSPs. And so I've been in the industry for probably a little less time than some folks, for about 15 years. And I think we were just making that shift as I was coming on board and starting to become familiar with what MSPs do and how they do it. And originally I was a network administrator. And so my focus was some of that break fix and awareness of what we're doing for organizations or what we're doing for clients. And we were really focused on, do we have all the hardware documented? Are we aware of the things that, like we were discussing previously, they're going to be end of warranty in the next 2 to 3 years? Are we, making sure that kind of those fundamental protections at the time, like having a firewall, having some type of endpoint protection, those were the concerns. Have we implemented these tools that at the time we considered to be good enough and doing what was required to provide those fundamental protections? And then as, that journey progressed for me, I think it was probably in 2013 or 14 when having RDP open to the world started to become a major problem for people. Like, I think it was, essentially that day, we had attacks coming through where people were being compromised through RDP. And then suddenly our mentality was like, whoa, now we need to start closing ports. Now we need to be aware of these things as being ways that clients can be hacked. And so then our mentality started to shift to being a bit more proactive and aware of like, okay, what can actually happen and take place when these things are exposed, when these things are there. And again, we were starting to make those moves, but I think when you start getting shell shocked, and it starts
Yeah.
becoming real, that's when you start to really pay attention. And then that changed the way we started thinking about security moving forward.
And ironically, I feel like at that time, we were still heavily focused on security through obscurity. Like,
Hmm.
I got this. We're going to put it on 3390 because no one
Right.
guessed that port.
Right. Yeah.
So, and then the shift happened, right? So, and I think if I think about that timeline, you mentioned 2013. I think my first experience of navigating someone that's been crippled because of ransomware and would have been actually was on an RDP exploit. But back then it was like, how quickly can we restore data from backups and minimize this future impact by getting rid of say 3389, et cetera. But that was pre-data exfiltration, right? And so the ironic thing, and if I think about the scenario that I went through, what kept them, say, from being all data gone or all data encrypted was the fact that one of the employees happened to be in a specific directory and they were being encrypted in alphabetical order. So once they figured out where the it was happening, they then just shut everything down, and of course that killed what was happening. But what was interesting is that was their XDR, right? Like that was the this is happening. These things are being crippled, but it was eyes on that caught it rather than some sort of tool or service that would have detected these things. And I don't think until probably even 2020 that we start seeing really proactive tools where they're killing something in action before it can do a whole lot. And I think that in the SMB space, we talked about this earlier, costs come into play. Like, is that where we should focus the spend is on things that will detect to reduce the blast radius, or do we focus on things that protect and prevent as best as possible the blast from happening at all, knowing that I only have so much money to work with, and every time we talk to a client, how much more money are you going to ask me to spend?
Yeah. And I think that that becomes that whole discussion that we have about around risk-based approaches. And, if I can get a suite of tools that handles 75% of the problems for a client, that is a great starting point when that client doesn't have a foundation or anything
Yeah.
else in place, right? So how am I, as a good partner and steward of my client, kind of providing these capabilities in a model that they can afford that's going to optimize, their risk reduction efforts, whether they know it or not, um, and then put them in a position where over time I can help them individually with the other 15% that's going to be unique to their business or to what they do.
Right. And then knowing that, what is it, 50% or 50, I think the statistic I saw was like all the tools that you can throw at something, you're still getting down to a number that's like somewhere around 55 to 58% of that number. So you're still at like what, 42% of that window of like it's still going to get through, which is a pretty high number. And then you look at like the human element and you're like, oh, that's why. If you take the
Yeah.
human element out, you're like 97% because, well, if you don't have people, well, then links don't get clicked on. You said something earlier, and you said it. You used the word a few times. Stewardship, and stewardship of technology, and being a good steward with our clients and helping them with that. It's interesting because 10 years ago, we didn't do any education with clients. The level of like, why you shouldn't leave your password on a post-it note, and I don't think it's any more or less problematic then than it is now. We just have a better understanding of the implications if those things are compromised. What are you seeing from an education standpoint? Because I feel like that's one area that still has that mindset of turn it on and walk away. Like, hey, we've got know before or fill in the blank. It's just one that popped into my head. To like, we've got a security awareness training program for you for X dollars a month. And you're like, click, it's on, and boom, we walk away, right? Like because we really can't own their education. They have to own the education, but we can definitely sell them stuff so that we can say, but we gave you the means to be educated. What are you seeing in that area? Because I think it's more than just the tools.
Yeah, I think where the conversation is shifting and where it has to start moving is where the risk is actually owned. And I think this was something we had uh, problems with many years ago, and I think it still persists today. Is um, clients, especially in the SMB space, kind of have this notion that once I give someone responsibility for my IT, anything that has the word technology or IT in it is now on the provider to handle, right? So
Yeah.
they have this idea of being able to put all of the risk in a basket and it goes over here to the MSP and the MSP owns all of it. And so I think where we're making headway as an organization is having those conversations with clients, those hard conversations about, look, you
Sure.
have the tools. Let's say they're in a space that's got to do with healthcare records, right? So we have to now have conversations about the need for training around protecting EPHI, the reasons they should be doing those things. Again, the client still has to make a decision to engage and to do those things, but now they're informed. Now they're aware that that's something they're responsible for, that they should be doing. But we're here to help them through the process. But ultimately, we're putting before them these things that they actually have to own and they have to do for their best interest, right, in that process.
Getting rid of the assumed liability is the proactive on your part to educate them on what is their responsibility, right?
Right. Yeah, you could, and I think that everybody gets tickled when you talk about shared responsibility matrices, and
Oh, sure.
yeah,
No one
every
wants to make them.
no, nobody wants to make them. Everybody loves to point to them when they do have them. And that was something that I've seen with clients. Again, when cloud technologies and moving things to the cloud was kind of the big, oh my goodness, I can save all this money. I can offload all of this responsibility. There are all these things that I now don't have to worry about. And then you
Right.
get there and you realize, well, wait a minute, they're taking care of 20% now. I still have the other 80. Or like you said earlier, oh, 58% of this is now handled over here. Now I have to do all these other things that, guess what? I wasn't aware of that I was actually doing on premise, or that I had to be doing, or that I should have been
Sure.
doing, that now the cloud provider is making me blatantly aware of, that I should be taking care of and doing. And now if I don't do it, you know, I'm not doing my due diligence and taking care of that system. So,
Well, responsibility matrix is an interesting one, especially when you get into who's responsible, who's accountable, and you think about all the vendors that an MSP uses, and quite often we see some how do I reduce the tool sprawl, that kind of thing. What's interesting to me is the number of scenarios where you hear MSPs, and I won't get into like necessarily the size of the MSP, but we're talking about the SMB space, so we'll just let that be, let that sink in. When someone says, "Oh yeah, and we monitor this 24/7, 365," and the question always comes into my head is, you do? Like, as the MSP, you're monitoring 24/7, 365, or you've put something in that is monitored, and it's that responsibility matrix of who is doing the monitoring, because it's probably not the MSP. At least not after 8 to 5, right? Like, there's who's watching this, and oh, by the way, when you're on vacation, you're down one person, who's watching, or you're out two people or three people, then who's watching? Because generally speaking, I think bad guys tend to try and operate in not your convenient timetable. Like, who's on it on Saturday? What are you seeing in that regards? Are you having conversations with clients around like, hey, we're putting these tools and services in place, but we're also not going to be the one that is going to be answering your phone call at 2 o'clock in the morning if you call because you can't log into your laptop, or maybe you are, but like, how do you have that conversation?
so in our particular case, we do operate, at least we have people available that you can call 24/7, and talk to and have kind of help you through a problem or an issue. Um, but from the standpoint of like security operations and monitoring and things of that nature, we work with third parties that, again, allow us to enhance our team's capabilities. And so
Right.
we have, but again, I think that this too comes back to kind of what the need for the SMB is, and kind
Yeah.
of being upfront about what your capabilities are and what you can do. If you are not a 24/7 operation, and you have a client who says, "Hey, I'm going to need to talk to somebody at 2 o'clock in the morning, or I do my best work between 11 and 3 a.m., or we're
Yeah.
open from 11 to 3 a.m." I think that again, being a good partner with an organization requires that you kind of say, "Okay, well, listen, well, we don't have people that are operating past 8 o'clock in the afternoon, or if they are, there's additional cost that comes into play. There's additional things we'd have to figure out to make sure the service fits you best." And so I think where we get ourselves into trouble as a whole, not organizationally, but as a whole, as a community, is when we use the word 24/7, 365, and we don't imply further or discuss further with clients what that actually means. Yes, you might get an alert, or something might get stopped, or your machine might
Right.
get isolated, but because it's Christmas weekend, Thursday night, we're actually not going to see you again until Monday. Um, and oh, by the way, if it goes beyond that, good luck, and we'll see what we can do in the tooling. And so Um, I think that that's where, as again, as it just an industry as a whole, when we talk about the difference between one provider and another, and clients have this expectation of just uniformly looking at three different businesses that are providing these services, and each of them says, and I'm doing air quotes, says for the
Sure.
radio, that we're 24/7, 365. What does that actually mean? Like, what is that as defined in a contract, in an
Right.
SLA,
You're
in
you're
an
not turning
agreement?
tools off, right? Like you're not like,
Right,
hey, at 5 o'clock, your AV is not going to work until tomorrow morning. So just so you
right,
know, right? Like, right. But I think this is kind of an interesting conundrum that a lot of MSPs face is that you know the tools do those things, right? Like they don't get turned off because it's nighttime. But it got me thinking about what does that mean when it comes to like, okay, we have a 2 hour SLA on tickets. Well, most ticketing systems have a pretty good automated response. So they get the initial, it's been created. So like, woo. And then you can set through automation, like at the 2 hour marker of like, okay, sign ticket to Robert.
right.
Boom. SLA met, right? I've seen that so many times. And yet I'm not proposing that that's necessarily right or wrong because in some cases, the client goes, "Ooh, look, it's been assigned. I know it's going to get worked on soon." You're helping remove that fear of like no one's going to see this ticket or my ticket's so urgent and yet it's just that I can't print on a Tuesday. But the same is true on the things that aren't ticket related, right? Like, and I think that's part of the whole, like, what is your SLA when it comes to, if XDR detects an event happening, is your response time to, look into that event, 2 hours, 4 days? Like, does the client understand, how that operation happens? Or like, hey, we shut down that machine and your client's angry because they were in the middle of something, you took the internet away because you had to isolate the device, and you're like, well, it was an emergency, and they're like, well, I dictate what an emergency is. Like, no, no, we decided it's an emergency because otherwise all of your devices would be offline. Have you ever
Yeah.
had those conversations or had to have that?
I think, a lot of the conversations I've had, just around helping like an SMB. So when I worked as a CISO, and consultant for several organizations, the interesting conversations we always had were, this is what like a framework says. So, most of the time when we're going in to consult with an organization, they say, I need to meet this framework. I need to do these things because I have this requirement to do so, this pressure, a contract, a legal requirement, whatever the case may be. And we say, okay, you need to implement this particular control. You need to have an endpoint protection on all systems, minimum. And I've had clients that have told me, like, yeah, we don't do that. And then my immediate kind of knee jerk response is, well, you should. And then the counterpoint to what you were saying is, well, we don't because we don't want to. And you're talking to somebody who, runs the business, owns the business. And so it's like, well, technically, the business owner has the ability to say that. And I think where we have a responsibility at that point to counter argue, coming back to your point about the business owner saying, well, I dictate what an emergency is. It's like, well, listen, we are here to protect you from the things
Right.
and make you aware of the things that can hurt you, that could do harm to your business, that make it so that this inconvenience of 30 minutes turns to 2 weeks of downtime or worse, that
Yeah.
you now have to recover from, and that you have to deal with, data exposure potentially, and people not being able to work and potentially not getting paid, right? So there's this ripple effect.
Right.
And so I think that where we do a good job, and have to do a better job, is when clients meet us with that level of kind of, I don't want to use the word being counterproductive in risk management, but they say, hey, I tell you what to do, or this is the definition of what an
Yeah.
emergency is. We have to remember what we're there to do, that we're part now educator in the process of taking care of these things and managing risk and having conversations. And we have to calmly kind of reiterate, look, here's what that would have meant. Here's why
Right.
this would have been bad. And, kind of de escalate in those conversations, and don't meet the client blow for blow, but more so kind of give them the ability to calm down and then have a conversation that's about what that actually meant and why it was important, and we can empathize with them on not being able to immediately get work done and then move them forward in that process. Now being educated and aware of why that was important, you know?
I think it also gets into the before versus after it happens, like that.
Right.
Wayne and I talk about this quite a bit. The having risk conversations with clients, or even internally with yourself. But like, I think we are collectively bad at talking about risk, because I can say, if I put all of these security tools in, we're mitigating significant risk. We're not labeling what those risks are, but in the security space, we know we've reduced your risk in so many different categories or areas of the threat landscape by just layering those tools in. But sometimes to the extent of either alienating the client from an understanding of what we're actually protecting them from, or B, we've put so many things in there that the probability of some of those things happening wasn't high to begin with, but they're still paying for something that is, reducing
Mm.
that small margin by even more, right? Like, we
Yeah.
took you from 10% to 2%. And they're like, wait, it was only 10% to begin with. That was my risk. Like, I would have liked to have known that.
Yeah. This is a great segue into kind of risk-based approaches and like proportionality when dealing with
Sure.
a risk, right? So you mentioned the number earlier, like 50%, or we're addressing 50%. And of course, we're throwing some best practice numbers out there loosely, um, without having a reference right in front of us for 2025. And so when we talk about risk based approaches, we look at proportionality, we look at best practice and standards, and cost effectiveness, right?
Right.
So we are making that decision in a lot of cases on behalf of the SMB, because if we were to try to sit down with an SMB and have a discussion about actual risk
They're
based
all no.
approach, they're all like, we have no risk. And oh, by the way, we can have zero downtime, zero data loss, um, and all of the other things that would essentially be 4 nines or 3 nines in that process. And
Yeah.
it becomes like, okay, that is definitely not something that we think would be feasible in this case because of cost. And now let's talk about
Well,
what we're actually doing.
but you bring up a really interesting. You said it, and this is an interesting one. So I remember I spent a lot of time in the VoIP and circuit provisioning space, and saying 5 nines is still 45 minutes of downtime. In theory, it's spread out over a 12-month period of time. That doesn't mean you don't have a 45-minute outage, and that was the only downtime you actually had.
Right.
So depending on that language, right? And this is where I think the SMB space it needs that education. Um, you know, to segue a little bit into, we had talked about this before. What is the real proposition that MSPs bring to the table, generally speaking, to the SMB space? And we said, well, how much does it cost for the SMB to hire somebody that would take on the IT responsibilities? And I think we see this across other areas of expertise, right? Like, I need somebody in HR. Well, there's 5 of us. Who are we going to get for HR? Well, we're not hiring an HR person, probably. We'll use, the bamboo HRs of the world to do that for us, or at least do a lot of the function, so that the CEO might have 5 hats, but the hat level of commitment is a lot lower because there's stuff in place to reduce that. So we agreed that the average is somewhere between 50 and 60,000 for a sort of generalist in IT, that we agree can do a lot of things for that company. But two of the things that I think we both agreed on that they can't do is they're probably not CISO material. Like, I shouldn't say CISO like that, but like security officer, from a really deep dive of being able to do that. So they're going to need somebody else to help with that. And then even that proactive, we call them CIO or CTOs, where they're making proactive decisions around, to what we talked about earlier before we got on the show. Like, when does this device need to be replaced? When should we consider, how should we be budgeting for our technology consumption proactively, so we're not hit with, like, we had 3 things go down at the same time and we can't, do see patients because all of our clinicians are tied to now one machine, which has reduced their, ability to see patients. what are you seeing in the regards of like whether it's internal or client facing? Because I think this gets into where you did this before. You've been a CISO. We see MSPs constantly talking about providing CISO or vCISO or CTO, CIO services to their clients, and yet the capability of that to exist within their own company um, seems like a big stretch. Is that crazy to say?
I do think that we are still, um, trying to use that term to kind of just talk about a security generalist for most SMBs and like, hey, here are the key things you need to be focusing on. Here are the key initiatives for the quarter, for the year, the things we've discussed last. Um, we are not in a lot of cases, and again, I'm using this broadly in what I've seen with MSPs and in reading and kind of going through different magazines and articles. We are still trying to move towards the idea in the SMB space of arming them with somebody who's a strategic security partner. The hardest conversations that I've had when I'm focused, whether I'm focused on one business or 100 businesses, is being able to talk to leadership and have them articulate their key goals and then aligning those things with security. I've had conversations with small businesses that you say, okay, well, what are your major technology goals and security goals for the year? And the kind of phrase they use at that point is like, well, I'm really just concerned with making payroll for the next 30 days for everybody that works here.
Sure.
So you're met with this need to survive that some organizations have, and they're like, look, I don't want to think about security. That's what you're here for. That's what you're doing for us. Like some organizations meet you with kind of this general, I just need to make sure things run and that people get paid. And then there are some organizations that have reached a point where they're now thriving or they're beyond those kind of means of shelter and water
Yeah.
and
But
and they're
what
ready to
but what
talk.
is security in that regards, right? Like
Right.
so this goes back to if you're the CEO of a manufacturing company, the things that you're probably thinking about is, what would cause downtime on the plant
Right.
floor or with my, crews going out into the field. Their priorities around like, well, yeah, I need to think about ransomware. Like that seems like a poor focus of their time. So they've engaged, the MSP. They getting the strategic alignment from the security services. They don't even necessarily care about the word security. What they care about is that my data is protected, so that it's not going to prevent me from continuing to do my job. To your point, I can still run payroll in 30 days. But what I think is often missing in these conversations is that where are those risks likely to come from?
Right.
I think it's because they'll put keys and locks on the doors and cameras in the environment and really lock down physical security with barbed wire and chain link fence. Then ask them, are they willing to invest that same uh, dollar per square foot, if you will, into their digital footprint?
Right. And I think where we're trying to make a difference, at least within our scope and who we work with as an organization, is moving that needle of helping clients to understand that digital footprint. I think is a huge, responsibility that
Yeah,
MSPs have. And then being able to communicate with them about what's important for them and kind of get them to kind of, for lack of better words, kind of self-identify that, hey, you know what? All data to me was important, but actually these things over here are the most important. Like if this were to become a down system, it would be a very bad day for us. And like when you can
right.
get the client to have that kind of realization, and then they can have that conversation about what is actually important for them and where their meat and potatoes are as an organization, then you know we can actually start the process of consulting around real data and
Yeah,
real risk and real problems versus everything. So that evolution, I think, is something that we're pushing for and that we've had conversations about, again, like you've said, the traditional risks, the traditional issues, and we're trying to move the needle towards clients being, again, like you said, the CEO doesn't necessarily need to be aware of all of the technical risks. That's why they're having someone else handle it for them.
right.
But that person that is working for them in a strategic capacity still needs to speak their language at a certain level and associate these technology risks with the actual pain points that they'll care about, which is business loss, loss of revenue, uh, loss of jobs, loss of data. that is going to matter to them. And I think that's where you really have a turning point for, organizations that do VCSO and are actually strategic in having conversations versus just saying we're VCSO and it's really just monitoring the tools and talking about budget and renewals. Those
Yeah.
things to me
Warranty.
are warranties. There's a stark differences between what a CISO would actually be doing versus how sometimes I think it gets passed along.
Sure. So that brings me to the last question. You're going through the GTIA Cybersecurity Trustmark. You're at the final stages. Some of the conversation that we've had has been about the SMB space, and I mean, really, if you don't have 50 employees and above in our space, that's really what we call SMB. So self-reflection, right? Um, when you went through the Trustmark, do you see that there's 18 domains, 177 safeguards? It can seem daunting. There's a lot in there. Obviously, as you get in there, you realize that you can solve for many safeguards in one fell swoop, depending on what the category is. Do you see a difference now looking forward at the things that you uncovered within your organization that will help you do a better job with your clients?
Sure, I think that's a great question. So I think I want to preface with like you were saying, when you look at this body of
Hmm.
information or this body of controls initially, it is daunting. You ask yourself, wow, this is a lot to do. How are you going to do this? Right. Especially as an MSP that's also an SMB. Um, you think about, well, everybody wears multiple hats. So how are we going to address this? And so after getting through the initial phase of understanding that we have a lot of things covered with capabilities that we already have in house, tools, technologies that are
Sure.
working for us, um, a lot of it was just the refinement of policy practice. Again, making sure that everything that we need to be aware from a risk standpoint is identified. Those pieces were not necessarily missing, but it's just a being able to sit down with everybody and have a conversation about risk and have their undivided attention for 40 minutes at a
Yeah.
time. So um,
Undivided.
yeah, undivided, with phones being in and alerts coming up. And so I think that where we get better is the maturation of formal process and the continuous improvement of those capabilities to um, kind of communicate our value, to communicate, with internal stakeholders about what we're doing and why we're doing it, to have people who come to the organization and they can see this program that's in place and understand how we do things. And uh, that I think translates to value for the client because, otherwise, from my position and my perspective, is MSPs do create risk. We are a vendor, just like any other organization, like SolarWinds, like I think Oracle has been the big, who done it
Yeah.
for the last 2 weeks. And the hard question that we asked ourselves in pursuing this and in doing this was, we say we do these things. Now we want to formally show people what improvement looks
Yeah.
like, what a willingness to eat our own dog food, for a lack of better words, is. And you know, for us, that allows us to sleep better at night because now we're telling our partners, our SMB clients, and our other clients that not only are we saying we are, doing best practice and implementing best practice, but we're showing it, we're proving it, we're doing it, and um, I think that's going to be a huge differentiator because now, otherwise, you're sitting in front of two other people or three other people with a client, and that client's like, well, they all say they're secure.
Right.
All of all of these businesses say
Yeah.
they follow CIS or NIST or whatever, and
We have
you know,
XDR.
yeah, we can answer your 50 questions questionnaire, or we can fill out a matrix for you and return it. To me, this is showing a willingness to go above and beyond and to not just raise the bar for our clients, but to kind of show the industry that like it's time to start moving toward, more transparency in how we as providers manage risk because we are a vendor, we are a third party that has a lot of access to a lot of organizations, and we have to start demonstrating that we're doing what needs to be done to secure our clients and to make their businesses safer.
Yeah, to kind of wrap up, I think just to summarize what you said, it's like you don't want your clients to have a better cybersecurity maturity than you, the MSP,
Right.
right? Because hey guys, are you guys using MFA when you log into our systems? Because we just want to make, and you're like, yeah, but like,
Mm.
thanks for checking. Like, I think that's, going back to the questionnaires. I think we're fast approaching the Aston-based space included. Think about like CMMC and what they're targeting that supply chain. The 7-person company that makes 8 millimeter bolts for whatever it is that's now needing to be more secure. And the questions that are coming are questions that we should be able to answer with not just yes, but yes and. Um, and I hope that, the message that's out there with regard to the trust mark and having MSPs like you go through it is that it is reasonable, it is doable, but more importantly, it's a you must. If you're not doing this, what are you doing? And so I'll say this, if you're not doing the trust mark, I really hope that you have, picked a framework that has an emphasis on a security maturity model and not a pass fail because I don't know what's going to happen to your company 12 months from now, but I know that what you did and what you've gone through today with a strategy of improvement continuously is very different from going, okay, let's prepare for our next pass fail. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. I've seen it. I've gone through SOC 2. I've gone through PCI audits for organizations where I'm on the receiving end of that. Um, and that pass fail mentality for me is kind of like any other test. Like once the test is done and I've passed the
attention
test,
gone.
all
Yeah.
right, I'll see you next year when it comes time to take the test again or
Cram,
whatever.
cram, cram.
Right. Make sure we've got the everything in line for the assessor this year and, do those types of things versus
Same
um,
flashcards.
same flashcard, same discussion points, copy,
Yeah.
paste, and update dates. And, those things have a certain level of accountability, but where I think the pressure or emphasis on this, you never are done. You never get to a point where you can say, "Oh, we're good. We can sit back. We don't have to improve. We're at where we need to be." Um, that to me is attractive because now you're saying, okay, if something like AI is the big thing now, and
Yeah.
it's everywhere. Okay, well, how are we addressing AI use in the client base? How are we having
Right.
conversations about AI? How are we reducing our risk of misuse of AI and doing those things? And guess what? Probably next year there'll be a policy about AI use and our responsibility and transparently using AI and holding people accountable for using AI. And um, but if you had a framework that takes 24 to 48 months for them to update because that's just the speed they work with in whatever the
Yeah.
SOC environment is, um, guess what? We're already at the next new big thing. You know,
Yeah, we've talked a lot about the academia world with regards to testing and all of that, and it made me think of, one of my kids has to do a math placement test this summer for the school he's going to, and a math placement test isn't pass fail. It's just figuring out how much your comprehension is at to what level before plugging you in to the appropriate class so that you can be successful. And I think when we look at the trust mark, the goal isn't to overwhelm anybody, but the reality is the things that are in the trust mark are things that you should already be doing because they were picked specifically for an MSP. The maturity process is like, okay, you didn't understand potentially what you had to do for that safeguard. How do we get to a spot so that you do and you can without it being, business altering in a negative way so that you can continue to operate your business? Like, that is one thing we keep emphasizing. This should not take away from you still going out and growing your business and having support and servicing your clients. It's meant to do this in parallel. So if you have to take it at a slower pace than others, that's okay, as long as you continue to move in a forward direction.
yeah, and that's exactly right. I agree with that 100%.
Any last words before we wrap it up?
No, I think that as Trustmark continues to kind of evolve and become more and more, I guess, table stakes for organizations and things that they should
Sure.
be doing. I would say to anybody who's listening, who's questioning whether or not they should go through the process, um, it's a no-brainer. Like in my opinion, if you tell your clients that you are a practitioner, a security expert, that you're, doing what's best for them, like this to me is probably one of the biggest no-brainers that I've ever gone
Sure.
through and done for an organization. So, I think that by the time people are telling us it's a requirement, it's already too late. It might as well
Yeah.
go ahead and start working towards some type of framework for MSPs.
Well, there you have it. For everyone listening, this has been an episode of MSP 1337. Thanks and have a great week.